Hey there, folks, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Big Stick Radio. My name's Russ, and I'll be your host in this new publication, which aims to do deep dives on geopolitics and national security. Before we get started, I just want to put out a big thank you to those of you who've been supportive of this new adventure of mine. I won't name names, but you know who you are, and I'm very grateful for your support. I'm also grateful to everybody who's already subscribed to our Substack and has been reading the articles that I've been putting up there on that publication so far. It's my hope that this podcast will be a great additional bit of content that you all can learn from and enjoy going forward. I wanted to start us off by telling you a little bit about what the Big Stick is and who I am. I've spent most of my adult life in the world of national security and foreign policy. I've worn a lot of different hats over the years. One thing I've noticed in my career thus far, though, is that there's a lot of great journalism on geopolitics and national security, and there's obviously a lot of great policymaking on those issues as well. But you can often find a lot of daylight in between those two things sometimes. So my goal here is to bridge the gap and to provide a resource that helps explain the world around us in a way that's accessible and easy to understand. If you're looking for a publication that's going to break down day-to-day news, there's a lot of great resources out there that I would highly recommend you seek out, but this probably isn't that venue. I'm going to try to do more work that is a deeper dive on specific issues that I think are not getting attention that they deserve. I'm going to try to avoid jargon when and where possible, and if I do engage in too much wonky speak, please feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'll strive to do better. But my goal here is to keep this as accessible to as wide of an audience as possible. For our first episode, I thought it was appropriate to discuss something big picture. It's the new year, 2024, and I think that gives us a great opportunity to reflect on what we've seen in 2023 and extrapolate that to get a better understanding of what we may see in the near future. So what I've got here are 7 different geopolitical flashpoints that I think you should keep an eye on in 2024. I should note that these aren't in any particular order, and that I do agree with the old adage that predicting the future is a fool's errand. I'm not trying to play Nostradamus here. First is the stalemate in the war in Ukraine. Now, I already know there's going to be some folks who are going to be a little upset by just that statement alone, but it's very clear based on the facts on the ground that the Russian invasion has been blunted, but so too has the Ukrainian counteroffensive that we were expecting to make some ground in the fall of 2023. Both sides have suffered remarkable losses. The Russian military reputation has been, I think, permanently tarnished for decades to come. The Russian military that invaded Ukraine a couple years ago is certainly not this big, scary Russian bear that we were told existed prior to the invasion. But in addition to that, Ukraine is also now in a bit of a crisis mode in terms of recruiting, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I want to just go through some specifics that we're looking at on the ground right now. First, there's been about 315,000 Russian casualties. Many of you probably read about that in that declassified U.S. intelligence report that many news sources covered back in December. That's disastrous. It's about 90% casualty rate based on the force that they organized to invade Ukraine. A massive failure by any measure for sure. However, there have also been around 200,000 Ukrainian casualties. Now, that's obviously not quite as many as Russia, but when you look at the proportionality in terms of population, this doesn't necessarily bode well for Ukraine. Ukraine is a population of 44 million people. Russia is a population of 143 million people. You just look at that math and you can pretty much tell that it does not favor the Ukrainian side. In addition to that, and I think that this cannot be overemphasized, the U.S. is officially out of Ukrainian funding money. Major General Pat Ryder, a Pentagon spokesperson, last week told reporters, frankly, just straight up, we're out of money. Many of you who are paying attention to the politics in D.C. may be aware there's a $100 billion border security initiative, which includes some additional funding to Ukraine within it. Now, that, as far as we can tell so far, has more or less stalled. We don't know where it's going to go, but there's been a lot of debate on either side as to what they want out of this agreement. And in the meantime, Ukraine is running out of important resources. And obviously, with the United States being the largest backer of Ukraine, that puts it in not only a recruiting crisis, but also a monetary one. When you can't get the main funding from your primary benefactor, which is the United States, that puts you in a seriously problematic situation. And if you look at nuts and bolts of this, the math actually lines up better for Russia in this scenario because right now they're in a stalemate with a country that ultimately has about 1/3 of the population to draw from. Whereas Russia, one of the benefits of being an authoritarian world power is that someone like Vladimir Putin can unilaterally put his entire country on a war footing. The entire Russian economy, based on many estimates right now, is really focused on this issue. Ukraine has put up a remarkable fight, but without the benefactors that are supporting its defense, it doesn't put it in a good long-term situation. It cannot fight this fight independently. In fact, the recruiting crisis in Ukraine is so bad that we're literally looking at old men being forcibly conscripted, as well as people who had illnesses and other ailments that would have otherwise prevented them from serving in the military whatsoever. So they're really getting to a point where they're scraping the bottom of the barrel for people, whereas the Russians have singularly focused their entire economy, and you could arguably say their entire country, on this specific issue. In addition to that, the Russian government has, of course, complete control over their state media and is able to continue to put out their propaganda to their own people and downplay the massive casualties that they have suffered over the past 2 years. It's harder to do that in Ukraine, despite the fact that they do keep a lot of things as state secrets in terms of what's going on in the war. But with the amount of Western attention and coverage that's going on, you're obviously going to have a harder time controlling the narrative. So when you have massive casualties like this, I think they do impact a country like Ukraine worse, not just from a numbers standpoint, but also from kind of a PR standpoint. Russia, of course, doesn't have that problem necessarily. Russians have been used to wars which involve massive losses and deteriorating manpower. This is really nothing new. Russian warfare for maybe the better part of a century now has involved human wave tactics. I mean, anybody who's seen that movie, The Enemy at the Gates, probably remembers that famous scene where they're just sending in waves of people, some of whom didn't even have a rifle, in order to fight back the Nazis, I think in Stalingrad, if I'm not mistaken. So, not saying that those casualties obviously don't affect Russia. They clearly do. They clearly do. But this is a country that is much more used to this because they don't put the same value on human life, unfortunately. And that's the reality. So I think if the stalemate continues to go on the way it is in 24, it puts Russia in an advantageous position to, if not keep some of their possessions that they've taken in this invasion, at the very least exert some kind of control over portions of Ukraine simply because they have the ability to wait out this fight more so than the Ukrainians do. Number 2, Europe pulls itself up by the bootstraps. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine shattered the presumption of security in Europe, which has sort of been a given since the end of the Cold War. After the Cold War, Europe was in a really great place in which it could focus on domestic policy, invest in its local economy, and look at its people and provide them the kind of social welfare and good life that they've become accustomed to for the past 30 years. Of course, when you're doing that, you're not focusing on your defense spending as much as you necessarily should be. And I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine really was the kick in the pants that many countries in Europe needed in order to take their own defense seriously. For many, many years, the United States has been the sole guarantor of European security. That isn't to say that there aren't effective militaries in Europe. There certainly are, pound for pound. But when it comes just to the capability level and who's really putting down the most investment in terms of security, I think it's pretty clear that the United States has been the guarantor of European security for at least 30 plus years. So that's going to change because the United States is increasingly shifting its focus from a security standpoint towards Asia. That is nothing new. It's been going on in many administrations, going back to President Obama, and it will continue to probably happen just because it's becoming increasingly clear that Asia is the geopolitical flashpoint that will determine the future of the United States, if not the world as a whole. And I want to be very clear about something that this is going to be bipartisan. This shift will continue no matter who wins the presidency in 2024. If you actually look at some of the defense strategies and other documents that the various administrations have put out, all of them focus on Asia in one way or another. Most of them recognize the threat posed by the People's Republic of China. That is going to require not just a refocus of political capital towards Asia away from Europe, but also perhaps resources. The United States has always operated in this sort of two-front security approach since World War II. The ability to fight two wars has kind of been the status quo for some time. Now, whether or not that has actually existed post-World War II in perpetuity, there's a lot of arguments you could be made on both sides. But the point is that in the world that we're driving towards, it's not going to be necessarily a guarantee that the United States can be the sole guarantor of security in Europe while simultaneously working to confront China in Asia. There's going to have to be some kind of refocus, whether it's from resources, physical or political, towards that fight. And that means that the Europeans are going to have to shoulder the responsibility for their own security. And I actually think that's a good thing. The European militaries, as they exist, may not be very large, but many of them are pretty good at a lot of things. If you actually have ever talked to or met someone who's in a European military, they're pretty friggin' impressive. They may be underfunded, they may not have all the resources they need, but many of them are very, very capable people. And I have no doubt that the European militaries, as they sort of come to the realization that their future's in their own hands, will do what they need to do to refocus their resources towards their own defense. And it will be a good thing because it's a good thing to have free democratic societies with strong militaries who are not reliant on one country, in this case, the United States, for their security. It's actually good to spread the risk out on this because ultimately everybody will be safer for it, especially as the United States pivots itself towards Asia. That being said, there's a lot of work to be done in these European militaries in order to get to that end state. I'm alluding to specifically a Wall Street Journal article which came out late last year, highlighting just how bad the state of the European militaries really is. I'll just pull out a few snippets here. The United Kingdom, Europe's biggest military spender, is now down to 150 deployable tanks and a dozen working artillery pieces. France, who once fielded one of the largest land armies in the world, contrary to what many French haters may think, is down to 90 artillery pieces. Denmark has none, and they don't have any submarines despite being surrounded by water on three sides. That being said, the worst case by far is Germany, the economic powerhouse of Europe, which has only enough ammunition for 2 days of fighting should they need it. That's problematic, folks. That's really, first of all, it's embarrassing. It should be embarrassing for the policymakers in those countries. I should highlight that the reason that we're in the state we are with the European military is that only 7 of 30 NATO members are currently meeting the 2% GDP defense spending guideline, which is outlined in the alliance. Now, just to kind of break that down for you, the NATO guideline, it's not a requirement. Some people call it a requirement. It's not a requirement. The guideline says that each member state should contribute 2% of their total GDP to defense spending. And that generally has been believed to be the number that the alliance needs to be at to provide for its own security. 7 of 30 members are meeting it. And of those seven, you'll note if you take a look at the actual list that there's a lot of big powers missing from it. Now, credit where credit is due to the seven who are meeting those guidelines, but when you have countries like Germany, for example, who have major economic power and they're not, well, that's a problem. That's a problem for Europe as a whole. It's a problem for NATO as a whole. So I have faith that the Europeans have recognized this problem and have actually already implemented some really promising solutions to it. So keep an eye out for that in 2024. Number three, US global influence continues to wane. It brings me no joy to report this, frankly. As a proud American myself, it is disappointing to say that 2024 may bookend the era of the American-led world order. This has been, I think, one of the best eras in world history, especially modern history. The US-led world order of the past 30 years has pulled millions of people out of poverty, has created remarkable security across the world. We've had less major wars than we've been seeing in history in the past. It's generally been good for everybody, at least for the most part. Now, I know there'll be some haters out there who will disagree with me on that, but I think it's very difficult to argue with the statistics. And unfortunately, that US-led world order is coming to an end. And there are a few reasons why, but I'll touch on a few that I think have been particularly important. And those are distractions from domestic turmoil, unclear strategic goals for decades on end, and the rise of many international rivals, most notably China, Russia, and the like. Now, you can't help the international rivals part. That's going to be inevitable. There will always be a new kid on the block to threaten the security that existed before them. But much of this problem is self-inflicted. And that's due to, one, I think, military adventurism in the Middle East. I'm obviously talking about the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Whatever you may think of them, they were costly in both blood and treasure. And I think also importantly, political capital. Anybody who's worked in the policymaking field knows there's only so much attention, only so many calendar days in the year for policymakers to pay attention to things. And for 20 plus years, all attention, more or less, was being focused on the Middle East, which, while important, is by no means the top tier strategic flashpoint in the world. I think at this point, it's pretty clear that there are other areas in which we were strategically blind, most notably Asia, and we're feeling the effects of that unfortunate lack of attention now. In addition to that, because of our distraction, you've seen major powers and major threats to the United States take advantage of this distraction, whether it's Russia in the form of their invasion of Ukraine or the Chinese unilaterally extending their influence in the South China Sea in many ways that are illegal, whether it's the Iranians who've activated their proxy groups, who've unilaterally disrupted international shipping. I mean, you're probably going to see a lot more aggression from these actors in the future because of our strategic blindness. Additionally, and I think this is an important point, there were a lot of presumptions made about globalization and the safety net that it would kind of bring, and the presumption that if we're all trading with each other and that we're all participating in this global market together, there won't be a lot of need to go to war with one another. I think there's some truth to that. I think the past 30 years have proven that there is certainly some good evidence to prove that was the case. But I also think that the benefits of globalization certainly brought with them some blowback for many, many places domestically that was not taken seriously enough, at least not by policymakers across many nations. And now we're sort of seeing a rejection by many of the American-led world order and the globalization that comes with it. And not just internationally, but obviously domestically as well. So that, I think, also is a problem. When you presume things will happen because of the benefits you're reaping from something in the immediate, it doesn't necessarily bode well for your future because you're most likely not paying attention to things that will come back to bite you later. Number four, China goes on a war footing. This is probably one of the favorite subjects of your various geopolitical analysts and folks who watch world events. Let's just say there have been many people predicting when China will go to war for a very, very long time. Years now, frankly. I will not try to tell you when or if that's going to happen. What I will tell you is that China is certainly on a war footing now, and it will be on a war footing even more so in the future. Why is that? Well, I think the biggest reason will be in 24 is because the middle class in China is, if not already falling apart, will be poised to fall apart in 2024 because property values in China are plummeting. Currently, there is a real estate crisis in China that's been going on for some time now. But just to kind of give you a sense of how bad it is, every 5% drop in home prices is killing off $2.7 trillion worth of housing wealth in China. And that's because 70% of Chinese family assets are tied up in property. Now, you don't have to be a financial guru to figure out that that kind of risk in any economy is extraordinarily high. There's not a lot of diversification here due to Chinese domestic policies, obviously. But this is going to have a very real impact on the massive Chinese middle class that's been used to a pretty nice lifestyle in the last 20 or 30 years. Additionally, we've seen that the effects of the crisis have led to a 2.2% drop in net worth per Chinese adult in 2022, and that's from UBS. There's also record high youth unemployment of 21.3%, which was reported back in June. That was recorded by the Chinese Communist Party themselves. This statistic was so bad that China is not going to publicize it anymore. Now, if the authoritarian government of China is so afraid of unemployment numbers in the future that they are not going to publicize them anymore, that does not bode well for the future of the Chinese economy. And it's having very real effects, too. Chinese youth aren't getting married. Marriages have been down by 50% between 2013 and 2022. You have, on top of that, an aging population. So you've got an aging population, which is going to need to be taken care of by young people who aren't getting married and having kids, and who are already going through an economic crisis of their own. This does not bode well. This is going to be a disaster for China in the future. So what do you do when you have a clear domestic economic crisis at your hands, and you probably can't really solve it in the near term? If you're Xi Jinping and his cronies in the Communist Chinese Party, one good option is to go to war. And if not go to war, engage in nationalist bellicose rhetoric that distracts people from the problems they're facing at home. Distract them with a foreign enemy. And what better enemy to distract them with than the age-old enemy in Taiwan? Obviously, Taiwan would be the primary target and has been for some time for China in any military conflict due to the fact they've wanted to reunite Taiwan with the mainland for decades now. And if you don't believe me, you can take it from Xi Jinping himself, who announced his intent to reunite the People's Republic of China with Taiwan in his New Year's speech this year. So it's pretty clear what the intent is here. I can't tell you when or if it's going to happen, but China will most likely use war or the threat of going to war as something that will distract their population from the economic woes, which are sure to continue, because you can't solve something like an aging crisis or a massive property and real estate crash through unilateral action. I don't care how many resources the Chinese Communist Party has. That's not something you solve overnight. So this is an option that they have. Going to war or going on a war footing is an option. I'm not saying it'll be the option that Xi will take, but you can certainly expect to hear about the war footing in China going forward into 2024. So next up, we have the long war in the Middle East. Everybody who's listening to this, I'm sure by now, is well aware of what's going on between Israel and Hamas in Gaza and the fallout that has come with that. I'm not going to try to get into too many specifics because the facts on the ground in Israel and in Gaza are changing regularly, so I will avoid that. But I will say there have been two major geopolitical impacts from the Hamas attack on Israel in October. First, it destroyed any hope of reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians, and it set back the Abraham Accords. Peace in the Middle East has been the goal of many, many administrations in the United States, and it's been kind of this holy grail that many have sought out, but none have really been able to find. And there's been various efforts to reach that over the years. It's never been successful. But most recently, the Abraham Accords were kind of an attempt by the Trump administration to open relations up between Israel and Saudi Arabia and other Arab neighbors in an effort to kind of just make the basics exist. A lot of folks probably don't know, but there are some countries which refuse to even recognize Israel's existence. So when you're trying to engage with mortal enemies on a geopolitical foreign relations level, but one group doesn't even recognize the right of the other to exist, that's a pretty bad starting point. I can't really think of many worse, but that's always been a bit of an issue. And the Trump administration used the Abraham Accords to try to create a little bit more intermingling amongst folks in the Middle East. And you might argue that it's been pretty successful. There was a lot of good progress made between Israel and its various Arab neighbors as a result of the Abraham Accords, but that's now gone. The fight with Gaza has created a situation in which any goodwill that was made by those accords is struggling at this point or is gone completely. Now, who benefits from this the most? By far, it's Iran. The Abraham Accords were a nightmare scenario for Iran because they would have essentially been pushed out of the neighborhood in the Middle East, more or less. Iran has, for decades now, utilized proxies and various other militia groups to kind of meddle in the affairs of the Middle East across the whole region, whether it's Iraq, Lebanon, whether it's in Israel or elsewhere. And frankly, it's been very successful. They've been able to regain a lot of lost influence in the region as a result of some missteps on the US side, but also just through some strategic decisions they've made over the years. The important thing to keep in mind here, too, is that the simple barbarity and the body count of the Hamas attack was such that Israel has to destroy Hamas root and branch at this point. There's really no way around that. The equivalent attack on the United States population-wise would have been 30,000 dead. So if you just think about that in comparison to something like 9/11, what would the U.S. response be in an equivalent situation? I think it's pretty clear that the Israelis and the Israeli government have to do this, and at this point don't really care as much about the public, reputation that they may develop in doing so. So that's something to keep an eye on. Number two reason why I think this had a really big geopolitical impact is because it was a spark for the larger conflagration we're now seeing involving the Houthis in Yemen and other Iranian-backed militia groups who are attacking U.S. forces across the Middle East. There's been, I think, well over 100 of those. And then in addition to that, of course, the Houthis have been attacking shipping going through the strategically crucial Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea. Now, countering these proxies is going to be a long, drawn-out affair. Don't expect that to go away overnight. It's going to take a long time to develop a good solution to that problem, and thus far, the solutions that we've seen have not been very effective. So keep an eye on that. There's going to be a long fight in the Middle East right now, and it's not going away anytime soon, especially in 2024. Number 6, global trade under fire. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, I think, have set a new precedent and given a new playbook for bad actors around the world. And the reason I say this is because the Houthis are a ragtag rebel group in Yemen who have been able to, through their attacks on global shipping, force a complete reroute of global trade away from the Red Sea and back towards Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope. They've essentially been able to turn the clock back historically more than 150 years to a time when the Suez Canal wasn't even open because they're forcing ships to go around Africa, which of course costs serious time and money and is going to inevitably have an impact on global goods and most likely inflation. So, if you are a bad actor across the world and you're looking to invest in a cheap solution that has a major dividend, then of course, why would you not follow what the Houthis have done? They've been using off the shelf drones and cheap missiles, most likely provided by Iran, I might add, to force an entire economic shift in the global world order. That is the dream. So I would expect other bad actors in the future to learn from this playbook and perhaps implement it in their own ways. We've actually already seen China do some stuff like this in the South China Sea. I would expect more of it. I would also expect Venezuela to perhaps try to do something similar if they can, maybe a little more difficult for them. But these are the kind of actors that would like to do something like this. And if they can borrow from what they've learned from the Houthis, then it would be great for them. Number 7, a refugee crisis in Pakistan. In November, Pakistani officials announced they would begin expelling more than 2 million Afghan refugees out of their country and back towards Afghanistan. This is going to be, in my opinion, a humanitarian crisis, because many of these refugees are political activists or folks who protested against the Taliban or otherwise supported U.S. forces during the occupation, who are going to be targeted by the Taliban in the short term. The Taliban, who of course now are running Afghanistan, have no desire to help these people, many of whom are their political adversaries. The Pakistanis don't obviously want them to be in their country anymore and have used some rather harsh measures to expel them. That's going to create not only a humanitarian crisis, it's also going to create a breeding ground for future groups like the Taliban and other extremists to recruit from the people who are going to be impacted by this. We've actually seen this movie before. We washed our hands of Afghanistan following the failed Russian invasion of the country in the 80s, which of course we supported the Afghan Mujahideen in their fight to defend themselves against the Russians. There's a great scene in Charlie Wilson's War where Wilson, played by Tom Hanks, lobbies for funding of schools, arguing that without these schools, ultimately the kids who are victims of this unfortunate situation in Afghanistan will find violence because they have no alternative. And it's kind of amazing that his colleague shrugs off the request and says, "Charlie, nobody gives a shit about a school in Pakistan." The irony there is amazing, right? Because you got one guy talking about Afghanistan, the other doesn't even realize that it's not the same country. In the years following, of course, you had Afghanistan fall into a civil war, and that created a situation in which the Taliban could come in and leverage that power vacuum to their own benefit. And of course, the rest is history, right? We know what happened next. They ultimately supported Al Qaeda, and now we have decades of results and blowback from that situation. You can't guarantee that failing to do something about this humanitarian crisis in the Pakistan-Afghanistan region will lead to the worst case scenario, but you can be pretty dang sure based on historical context that extremist groups will utilize the suffering of those people over decades for their own benefit. And if we don't start paying attention to the kind of blowback that we see from those kinds of situations and start thinking long term, we're going to see a lot of problems going forward. So keep an eye on that I think it's going to be a much bigger deal than it's getting attention for right now. So that's all I got. I appreciate you listening so far, and I would encourage you to please go to my Substack, thebigstick.substack.com. We're also on Twitter. Be sure to give us a follow at The Big Stick. I'm very excited for the things to come, and please, if you enjoyed this, all I ask is that you share it with a friend and spread the word about what we're doing over here. But until then, I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and I thank you very much for tuning in. Bye now.